Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and a warm welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. On our panel tonight we have Lord Daniel Moylan, who is a Conservative peer, former advisor to Boris Johnson, Joe Phillips, a political journalist and commentator, Freddie Sayers, executive editor at UnHerd.com, and Danielle Boxall, who's media campaign manager for the Taxpayers Alliance. If you'd like to ask a question, you can phone on 0345 6060 973 and you can text on 84850. Email Iain, IAIN, @lbc.co.uk.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet @LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, good evening to you all. Let's crack on with our first question. It's from Desmond in Tunbridge. Hello, Desmond.
Hi there. Yeah, my question is, are MPs dropping their standards in order to support Boris Johnson? And are we also dropping our standards of what we should expect from our MPs? I mean, there's been a lot of support for Boris, saying that he's done a good job. So if we had a new roof put on our house and we thought it looks great and it continued to leak, would we say that the roofer has done a good job?
Daniel Moylan.
Well, I think there are sort of two parts to that, aren't there? One is about standards and the other about whether the government is doing a good job or not. And obviously people have two different views on whether the government's doing a good job, and that's partly to do with politics. And I happen to think the government, in very difficult circumstances, has done a reasonably good job, and I'd speak up for that. But I perfectly respect the fact that other people will take a different view. As far as standards are concerned, I think a lot of this is down to a matter of perspective, and the perspective is often driven by where you start from politically. Some people think that the whole Partygate thing is a sign of a government that is completely sort of morally corrupt, and other people think that it's a relatively minor sort of thing that shouldn't have happened, but in terms of the scale of the thing and the proportion, it's something more akin to a speeding fine, shouldn't happen either, than it is to sort of mass murder or whatever. So I don't think MPs are letting their standards slip, and I don't think the public is either. They'll reach a judgment on what they think about the Conservative Party and what they think about the Prime Minister, both his performance and his character and actions, when it comes to a general election. And that's the right thing, because we live in a democracy, and our leaders should be chosen ideally through the ballot box and not through sort of press campaigns and things like that. So ideally, that's how you...
Is it a press campaign, really?
Some of it's a press campaign, some of it's a politically driven campaign, some of it... But I agree that, you know, the to and fro of politics doesn't mean you always change Prime Minister only at a general election. I'm simply saying that that's the more desirable way of changing it, because it's the result of a democratic process. Everyone can participate.
The Boris Johnson that you worked with when he was Mayor of London, how different is that Boris Johnson to the one that we see today?
Not very different. And I think one of the things I insist on is that I never knew on a single occasion in the 8 years I worked for him, and Boris set out to tell a lie in his public role, that he set out saying, right, we're going to tell completely the opposite of the truth today.
But isn't that the problem, Daniel? He doesn't set out to tell lies, he just lies.
No, and I don't find occasions when he did tell lies. I mean, you know, it's very hard when you look back at that period and you say, where is this history of lying in public office? He made remarks in the House of Commons which I haven't actually examined in the sort of detailed forensic scrutiny, but I'm sure at the time he believed, because he believed in a work environment, and he'd had advice, because it's obvious other senior civil servants believed that some of this was okay as well, because they were there, that work in a work environment where everyone was working together all the time anyway, on the odd occasion, and most of the time he wasn't there for most of these parties, but on the odd occasion
he was for half of them.
No, well, on the odd occasion he stepped in, that given that this was a work environment and this was allowed. I'd only say also one other thing, and I objected to this at the time when it came through the House of Lords. You had these laws that came out, and they changed every few months, weeks sometimes, and they were as thick as your arm practically. And they had great detail in them about what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. And, nobody ever read them. It's certain the police...
No, but you might think the Prime Minister who brought in those laws would know what those laws were.
You wouldn't think the Prime Minister had actually sat down and read them, because the lockdown worked not because people were asked to read laws. The lockdown worked because people accepted information in the form of slogans like Rule of Six and whatever and so on. That's how it was all communicated. And it's perfectly obvious the police didn't understand the rules as they changed from time to time, because half the fines they issued had to be given back because they weren't properly applied. So
you could apply that to every single law, couldn't you?
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in that, because if you start passing detailed laws, if you have detailed laws that affect corporations like companies and others who have the legal resources to examine and understand those laws and how they affect them, you have one standard. If you have a law aimed at ordinary people like you and me, saying you can go to this shop but not that shop, you have to do this, you can only do that. Oh, and by the way, last week it was only two of you.
It's like me saying it's okay for me to break...
Nobody can understand what they're being asked to do.
It's like me saying it's okay for me to break the media law because, it's very complicated and I really can't get my head around it all.
Because you work
it is very
for a
complicated.
Media, it is complicated, but you work for a media corporation, a large and successful media corporation, that employs lawyers who can understand that law.
But he's the Prime Minister.
It's vital to those corporate interests, and then they apply it to you in the bite-sized form that you can digest, and you stick by it.
I wish that were true.
Sure you do.
Joe Phillips.
I can't believe it. I mean, I just can't believe it. He's the Prime Minister. He made the laws. Lots of people think that the lockdowns were too convoluted, too complicated for reasons that Daniel has just articulated. But Boris Johnson, was the person who decided that's what we were going to have to live with. He is a moral vacuum, and all the time Conservative MPs sit there and hope it will go away and hope something else can be, it was COVID, it's the war in Ukraine, it's the global downturn in the economy. It's not. He's a man who was elected with one aim only, which was to be Prime Minister. And it's quite
get Brexit done.
Well, yeah, so he's got Brexit done, but he had no plan for what would happen after Brexit. So we're now having this nonsense about let's go back to imperial measurements and things like that. We'll be back to farthings and threepenny bits soon. It's ridiculous. And I think it's time that Tory MPs, decent Tory MPs, actually realise it's not about whether you think...
So a Tory MP that supports Boris Johnson is indecent? Are you really saying that?
Yes, I do believe that. And it's not about... It's ever so easy to trivialise Partygate. It's not that. It's about the lying. It's about the covering up. He doesn't even have the gumption to stand up and say, yep, we made a mistake.
He did say that in the House of Commons last week, to be fair to him.
Last week, that's an awfully long time on. And this idea about people
right. Well, he said it within 3 hours of the Sue Gray report coming out.
Yes, but he didn't say it at the time when it was first reported.
No, because he said... And I'm playing devil's advocate here, I want to emphasise, but he did say in the House of Commons, I have been assured that everything was in order.
He's the Prime Minister.
Yeah, a Prime Minister who takes advice. That's what Prime Ministers do. Can you imagine
Theresa May, David Cameron, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, John Major, go back as far as you like, even having an inkling that there was this going on? I can't believe that Boris Johnson didn't know what was going on. And if you walked past a room where there was a party going on, and this idea that it's your leader's duty to go and have a drink with colleagues who are working hard, well, try telling that to some of the people who worked in the NHS and care homes. The man's a disgrace, and so are the people who completely support him.
Freddie Sayers. So let's just remind ourselves of the question. Are the Tory MPs dropping their standards in order to support Boris Johnson, and are we dropping our standards in what we expect of MPs?
I think there might be something else going on here. If you try to understand where's all this anger coming from, is it just at Boris Johnson? Is it really about these so-called parties? I mean, you see the pictures of them, they don't exactly look like parties we'd all rush to attend. Some of the lockdown infractions from American politicians were really quite scandalous in luxury restaurants and stuff. None of that has been happening. It feels to me a little bit like the fact of the rules being so absurdly convoluted, absurdly micromanaging, and basically impossible day to day to make full sense of, has been so exposed that people are almost guilty or a little bit embarrassed that we all went along with it. It sort of reveals in retrospect that the whole concept of trying to micromanage people's lives to that degree is just not a practical way of governing. And I think some of this anger is kind of transferred, to use a Freudian term, onto Boris Johnson, when actually maybe we're all a bit angry with ourselves that we went along with this for so long. And evidently, if the people actually making the rules didn't take them as seriously, neither should we.
OK, Danielle, Boxall.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that this question actually draws out, and I don't think it's just about Boris Johnson. I think there's a wider question about MPs here, and given some recent scandals, I think we should really rethink about how MPs are acting in public life. I do think it's only a few small examples of MPs that have been guilty of these sort of, indiscretions. And I think, it's right that we should call them out and, they should be banished from being MPs as they have been. Do I think Boris Johnson's got anything to do with those particular examples? No. Do I think he has something to do with a wider problem with MPs? No, I don't really think that there is a wider problem with MPs at the moment. I know a lot of them are making up their minds at the moment. There's a public inquiry going on, so we'll see what that actually comes out with. I mean, that could take quite a long time. So that is another consideration for MPs is, what is going to be the result of this parliamentary inquiry. So I think a lot of them are still, keeping their mouths closed at the moment and not really coming out with much to say. They're also waiting for their constituents to, write letters and see what they say. I think, it is a point that perhaps Boris, if he did believe that there was something going on, that he should have come out straight away and apologised. I mean, there was a party in the Department for Education, I believe, that happened at the same time. And they came out straight away and said, OK, yeah, we hold our hands up. This happened. We're very sorry. Nobody's talked about it since. I think the fact that this investigations and about the party stand was ongoing is slightly... It's taking too long, I think.
Daniel, that's a really good point, isn't it? Because not just on this, but on quite a few other occasions as well, Boris Johnson has ended up apologising. But you think, well, if he'd actually done it at the beginning, he could have at least got some credit for it, whereas he has to be dragged kicking and screaming to doing it, and then goes around the tea room saying, well, I don't know why I did that, because I don't think I've got anything to apologise for.
I don't know what he just said around the tea rooms. I think you have to remember one important thing. The moment the police inquiry was announced, Boris was not in a position where he could say anything publicly about the whole Partygate thing. If he'd said anything to defend himself or to whatever, it would have been regarded immediately by the opposition as an unwarranted interference by the head of the government in the independent operational activities of the police. So you'll notice, if you look at his record, he goes completely silent on the question then. There are no apologies, no admissions, there's nothing said until the police investigation, the police announced they're concluding their investigation. That's actually why I think it's a disgrace that Keir Starmer has effectively interfered with the Durham police operation by announcing what he would do if he's found guilty. But that's a side issue. So what that makes it look like is that Boris is dragged into apologising and so on. But actually, he will have been advised by lawyers and tied down and told, you can't say anything about this because it's an ongoing
he could have done before the police got involved.
He could.
He could have done, but I don't think at that stage even he knew the extent of what was going on.
But he either knew there was a party or there wasn't. He either knew he'd stood there and had a drink.
I don't think he regarded it at the time as a party, but as a legitimate activity.
But
and that is a matter... Yeah, but that's your view.
Well, no,
and
that was the law.
Well, it's...
Those were
the law doesn't use the word party at all. So that if you look, let's go back to this legislation that you expect Boris to have a detailed knowledge of.
He's the Prime Minister,
but clearly you don't have a detailed knowledge of. And the word party never appears in the legislation. There is no prohibition on parties. Strangely enough, there is no prohibition on drinking alcohol. What the law said was something to the effect that you couldn't have a gathering unless it was reasonably necessary for work purposes. Now,
is a leaving do reasonably necessary?
If you can see, Ian, I'm not going to comment on that, but you can see how somebody could take a view that in the context of somebody getting together for a drink and a packet of crisps, as somebody is leaving, might be regarded as reasonably necessary.
Maybe, but a lot of people listening to this...
see that other people would say, take a much stricter view.
Well, a lot of people listening to this...
It's not straightforward, you couldn't go to a party. That's irrelevant. That's got nothing
No,
to
it's
do with
not
the law.
irrelevant, because a lot of people listening to this will say, well, it's okay if the Prime Minister thought it was okay to attend a leaving do. What about attending a funeral, which people were banned from doing? That's a gathering, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, but it wasn't necessary for work purposes. Look, you can play this two ways, can't you? You can say, let's stick to exactly what the law said. The Prime Minister should have known exactly what the law said. You don't, but that's what you want the Prime Minister to do.
Well,
And
if
you
he's making the
you
law,
can sit
I'd
and
expect him to
argue it.
abide
He
by
doesn't
it.
make the law. The law's made by Parliament, nor is it written by him. Boris doesn't sit there writing
Well, that's
the law.
hair splitting, isn't it?
You know, but you can sit and argue this as lawyers, or you can say, which I'm perfectly willing to say also.
See, where
you can say
where your
what's
argument
the general
falls down.
impression and the look of it. And if you took a look at it from the look point of view, then yes, the comparison with a funeral. is a
Where
very
your
fair
argument
comment.
falls down is that I know for a fact that there were detailed discussions about all of these regulations around the cabinet table when Boris Johnson was present. So just on that basis, he should have at least known what the regulations were.
He is astonished if there were.
I suspect we could talk about this for the next 40 minutes. A quick one, Freddie.
Given how unbelievably leaky Number 10 Downing Street has been, it's almost beyond plausibility that had they known it would have been such a big scandal, all these people would have cheerfully attended it and taken photographs. So there's a sense in which it couldn't possibly have been.
No, but there were
knowingly
people in Number 10,
transferred.
as we've found out, who were warning against these call them parties, gatherings, call them what you will. There were people there saying this runs in danger of breaking the law, and they were ignored, even by the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, who was the one that was organising some of them. So I don't think that washes.
I'm not defending Boris Johnson. In fact, I hate the idea because
Well, you're sounding as
I'm
if
not
you
a fan. I think the big mistake was bringing in those rules in the first place in the manner that he did.
Okay.
And the fact that he's been exposed like this hopefully means that
Right,
politicians...
we're going to move on in just a moment. You're listening to or watching Cross Question on LBC. It's 19 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
22 minutes past 8 on LBC. We have Daniel Moylan with us, Joe Phillips, Freddie Sayers and Danielle Boxall. Let's go to our next question. It's from Nikki in Enfield. Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Ian. My question for the panel is, would it be better for Labour to have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister for the next election? And also, would it be better for the Tories to have Keir Starmer in power for the next election?
That's what I call a perfectly balanced question. Danielle Boxall, let's come to you first.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think we're talking a lot about personalities and, charisma and how people present themselves. But I think, as much as Boris Johnson presents himself in a certain way, and perhaps Keir Starmer is the antidote to that in the way that he presents himself, I think what's really lacking from both sides is some actual policies. I mean, we've seen, obviously, the cost of living support package that was announced last week, but there isn't really anything that is sort of supporting people going into the next election. There's no sort of long-term plan there. And I think that's what I'd really like to see from both parties, is what they would actually like to do.
A shiver just ran down my spine when you said long-term economic plan. Wasn't that George Osborne's slogan all the time?
I think it was, yeah. It's must be stuck in my head. But
I think it's a really interesting point, though, because the Conservatives at the moment don't seem to have a narrative beyond what you were suggesting a moment ago, Joe, about sort of bringing back pounds and ounces and grammar schools and hanging necks. Maybe not hanging, but you know what I mean. You've got to have a positive vision for the future, and at the moment they're not articulating that, are they?
Yeah, and I think the problem is that, all this talk about Partygate thing is sucking a lot of the air out of the political discussion and what policies and what the actual parties want to achieve going into the next election, what their future vision for the country is. And I'd really like to see somebody actually coming forward and actually producing a kind of, plan, a document, anything that we could actually get hold of and actually see what these parties want to do when they're in power. And I think that would actually be really helpful for the electorate as well.
Freddie?
Well, the weird thing, though, Danny, is that when policies do come out, they get talked about for about 48 hours, and then everyone wants to go back to talking about Partygate or something else. I mean, you were slightly dismissive of the £400 giveaway to combat the energy price hike. In any normal world, that would be quite a substantial policy that people would talk about. We've had a war in Ukraine where Boris Johnson is sort of credited with leading the European response and everything. No one really likes to talk about that either. In fact, we're sort of going back to this parties thing almost obsessively at this point.
That's obviously the media's fault, isn't it? Because that's where all the criticism comes. It's us who are obsessing about it, and it's not what people are talking about down the dog and duck. I'm not sure I agree with that.
Well, I'm a bit sceptical about some of these opinion polls, and I'm talking as someone who used to be closely involved in making them.
Indeed.
And, you get these numbers saying X number of people think Boris Johnson should resign. But I remember, if you want to get a nice news story out of an opinion poll, you ask, should X politician resign for Y bad reason? And normally you get a majority. They did it for Jeremy Corbyn, Theresa May and everyone before. So I think we should view these with a little bit of a pinch of salt. 2 years is quite a long time. And as we've seen, even in this short year, a lot of big things can happen. And whether you love him or loathe him, Boris Johnson has a way of lucking out. So I wouldn't bet against him at this point.
Joe Phillips.
I think Danielle's right about policy, and I think, to be fair to all parties, there was no point in having any policy when we were hit with COVID and the pandemic. It was a sort of a united front, if you like, for some people, to try and deal with that and the fallout.
Sly little dig in there, I noticed.
Yeah, I know. Somebody once said it's having a knife in your sock, which I don't quite know, but I think it's a bit like being a peaky blinder. But I do think, it's thrown everybody off kilter. The problem is when you have these ridiculous announcements about imperial measurements or crinoline skirts or whatever it is, nobody takes them seriously. So, we have, big serious announcements like levelling up, which are then analysed, and actually they don't.
Can we go back to the question?
Yes, sorry, yes.
Which is, would it be better for Labour if Boris Johnson stayed in his position? Would it be better for the Tories if Keir Starmer
I think probably for the Labour Party, yes, if he carries on like this, and I think this trickle, and we'll see what happens in the two by-elections later this month, next month. I think for the Tories, if Keir Starmer stands by his word, gets a fine and resigns, the Tories might be sorry because they might get somebody that appeals to the public more. But, it's not about charisma.
Who do you think appeals to the public more than Boris
Rachel
Johnson?
Reid.
Question.
Oh, sorry, on the Labour side, Rachel. Do you think Rachel Reid? Do you? Okay.
I mean, she's very coherent.
And on the Tory side?
Frankly, anybody. I think the Downing Street cat would be better. I mean, Jeremy Hunt's a safe pair of hands. I know lots of people don't like him. But I think, anybody is better to try and restore the dignity and integrity and honesty. Those last two words are what Boris Johnson himself has removed from the ministerial code.
Daniel.
Well, to answer the question, Boris Johnson is the greatest vote winner that the Conservative Party has by a very long mile, looking at the existing field, by a very large mile. While Keir Starmer, the British people will never have Keir Starmer as Prime Minister because they watched him in full public view try to destroy their vote for Brexit quite consciously, and they're not going to have him as Prime Minister. And so I think the current combination...
Even 5 years on, do you not think people's memories fade?
To some extent, but people will always remember he was the man going around trying to engineer a second referendum on a rigged question so that they could be robbed of their vote. And I don't think they'll ever forget that. So I think the current combination is very good for the Conservatives. And, if Keir Starmer is replaced, you might get somebody more credible. I'm not going to put a name on... I'm not going to suggest who it might be, but you might get somebody more credible. But given the Labour Party's history of shooting itself in the foot, you might get somebody even worse. I don't know.
Freddie, I don't think you actually answered the question in your very interesting answer.
I think it's hard to bet against Boris Johnson at this point. And, the fact that we're mentioning people like Jeremy Hunt as the next best thing, do we really think he's going to be delivering those votes in the Midlands or the Red Wall? It doesn't seem at all convincing. A lot of people feel very angry with him, Boris Johnson, but he did have this weird gift of appearing as one person to one set of voters and a different kind of person to another set of voters. And that is, whether you like it or loathe it, that is a political gift. And in 2 years' time, that might start to be re-burnished and glow again. Who knows? But at the moment, if we're talking about Liz Truss and Jeremy Hunt as the next best alternatives, it's very hard to imagine how they would get a better vote.
Danielle?
Yeah, well, you can't deny that Boris Johnson is a sort of campaigning beast. He loves it. He absolutely feeds off of it. And he has a recognisability that no other politician has. So I do think that is a strong selling point for the Conservatives. But whether that recognisability is for slightly more tarred reasons now, that will be waiting to see how it sticks in people's minds. But yeah, as I said before, I think both parties... for me, it doesn't really matter who's in charge as long as somebody actually says what they want to do with the country and says, what policies they've got to bring forward, put it on the table and really...
That is interesting at the moment. You've got a Conservative Party that doesn't seem to have a vision for the future, and if Labour has got one, they haven't spelt it out to us either. Now, you can say, well, there's 2 years before a general election, but we're getting to the point where both parties have really got to set out the stall. Nikki, you asked a very impartial question. What's your answer?
So my answer is that I've always been a Conservative voter, but I'm quite tired of being fed dead cats, if that makes sense. So
I think we'd all agree with that.
Yeah. But I'd quite like a clear leadership focus, but I don't think we can get past that with this leader currently. So I'd quite like to see another leader take the place and really lead us into a place that
who would you like to see?
Conservative Party. I would say Jeremy Hunt, but I'm not entirely sure. But I wouldn't vote for the Labour candidate as they are, or anyone in the Labour Party as they are, because I can't see any clear policies that would align with my lifestyle. So, yeah.
OK, Nikki, thank you very much for that. I think the thought about Jeremy Hunt, I know you reacted rather adversely there, Freddie, but there might be a lot of people who might think, well, we've had a lot of excitement. Let's have a bit of serious government for a change.
There was a moment during the pandemic when Jeremy Hunt appeared on a panel and was talking approvingly about how his sister had actually been welded into her home in China. She was living there. That's how extreme he accidentally got during this pandemic. He was so in favour of extreme COVID restrictions that he lost.
But he since said he wouldn't have lockdowns.
Lost his sense of, well, a lot of people have revised their views from a year or a year and a half ago. I think what we saw there is the slight menace of the arch technocrat that I don't think is going to be either a vote winner or
You see, Wesley on Twitter says, I don't want an election beast running the country, quoting Danielle. I want honesty, integrity and someone doing the right thing. We'll come to more of your questions in a moment on Cross Question. It's 8:32. Let's get the latest news headlines on LBC from Andy Ivey.
Another Tory MP is calling for the Prime Minister to face a confidence vote and suggested the number of letters needed to trigger one may now be close. Andrew Bridgen has told constituents in North West Leicestershire there's still a lot of anger after the Sue Gray report into Partygate. UEFA has commissioned an independent report into the events surrounding Saturday's Champions League final in Paris. Liverpool supporters were caught in a crush and tear-gassed by police before the match. Merseyside officers who were there say the vast majority of fans behaved in an exemplary manner. Transport for London says it plans to keep all underground stations open over the Platinum Jubilee weekend, despite the start of industrial action. But it's warning passengers to avoid using the tube unless necessary next Monday, when members of the RMT union are striking for 24 hours. LBC weather, another chilly night. Tomorrow, cool with some heavy showers around, especially in the north and east, a high of 17 degrees.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:35. Let me reintroduce you to the panel if you've just joined us. Joe Phillips is a political journalist and commentator. Freddie Sayers is executive editor at UnHerd. And if you've never heard of UnHerd, it's not spelt the way you think it is. It's UnHerd. What is it, Freddie?
Thank you, Ian. We are fighting against herd mentality, and we are bringing otherwise unheard ideas to the fore.
Excellent. Danielle Boxall is Media Campaigns Manager at the Taxpayers Alliance, and Lord Daniel Moylan is Conservative peer and former advisor to Boris Johnson. I always get told off when I say Lord Daniel Moylan. People say, you can't say that, that's not right. You have to say Lord Moylan. But anyway, I like to go against tradition. Sarah is in Tyndrum. Where is Tyndrum, Sarah?
Oh, it's on the A82, halfway between Glasgow and Fort William, and it's on the West Highland Way as well. So there you go.
Sounds idyllic.
Quite remote.
What's your question?
My question is, what would you say to small business owners like myself who are struggling desperately to find enough staff to keep their businesses going, having weathered the pandemic, taken on a lot more debt, etc.? What would you say to us? What do you think is accounting for this terrible staff shortage, and what are the solutions?
Joe Phillips.
Well, Sarah, first of all, can you explain, well, maybe tell us what your business is, and is the problem a shortage of people or not enough money to pay people?
Right, my business is a roadside diner. It's a very busy business. So I'm in a quite a remote village, and we have some locals and other labour we have to import, so we have staff accommodation. We've got 28 staff. 20 of them are core staff. 8 staff we bring in kind of seasonal to top up, because it is a seasonal business to some extent, although we're open all year round, 7 days a week from 7:30 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. We turn over almost £2 million a year. So we're paying in all the different taxes.
£2 million on a roadside diner?
2 million.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very popular. And we pay a lot of taxes, to the government. We're just a small business, we're nothing fancy. And way before all this started, we were a living wage employer, okay? So we've tried to be a reputable employer. We do modern apprenticeships and so on and so forth. Anyway, now we are really struggling to find people, to the extent that we haven't got enough people to open up completely fully. So our coffee kiosk isn't open, for instance. And our management are being strangled by the constant kind of trying to recruit people, trying to train people, trying to find people.
Right, Jo, you got more than you bargained for.
Yes, I did. And I want to go to this roadside diner. Can we take the show on the road to Tyndrum?
Well, we went to Belfast. Why not Tyndrum?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a problem that is facing businesses, and particularly in catering. It's hard work, it's long hours, and it's not brilliant money. And I'm guessing that where Sarah lives, she said it's a fairly sort of remote rural area, there are problems of transport. So, in order to make a job work, if you're not earning a lot of money, you've got to be able to afford to get there. And you've got to be able to know that the hours you're working are actually giving you enough money to live on. So there's a lot going on here. I mean, there's the squeeze on the cost of living, which we all know about, regardless of what job you're in and what you're doing. There is a shortage of qualified people. I mean, every restaurant in the town where I live has got signs up: chef wanted, waiters, waitresses, front of house, kitchen porters. I mean, there are an enormous number of vacancies. But, for instance, in seaside towns where the second homeowners have bought up places that they then Airbnb, local people can't afford to live locally. That means they have to travel further in. That means that they've got the cost of either running a car with the cost of petrol, or they're paying bus or train fares. So there are all of these things. I mean, we have to look at this in a much more sort of holistic way, which sounds a bit naff, but you know what I mean. In the areas in which we live, how can we draw on, and how can we make sure that local people have got the skills to support the local businesses? I mean, the same is true in agriculture. There's a huge shortage of fruit pickers and farm labourers. But do you remember that was a dead cat, wasn't it? Or we're going to get lots and lots of British people to go and pick strawberries and carrots and what have you, and that, I think, ended up with about 2 people doing it.
I don't think you can pick a carrot, to be fair. But it isn't part of the problem here that we, for so long, I'd say for at least 20 years, we've been operating a very low-wage economy. We've had lots of immigrant labour where employers have paid them really not the going rate. And Daniel Moylan, it's all catching up with us now.
I think it's very hard to say that the model we had of an economy based on the constant importation of cheap labour from overseas was either socially acceptable or indeed sustainable economically. And we were going to have to confront this at some point, Brexit or no Brexit. I mean, the number of sort of Polish young people with degrees in nuclear science who are willing to be baristas will eventually stop as they have higher incomes in their own country as things level up. I think there's that. I think there's something else I'm going to say which I can't actually substantiate, and I may get shouted at for saying it, but I think one of the effects of the pandemic and people staying at home for so long is that quite a lot of people have been reluctant to go back to work, and I think the labour force has shrunk a bit in that sense. So that, being in the routine of going to work, and perhaps they don't need the money so much. And I can't explain this. And
But what's the solution to it? Because I think you're absolutely right on that. I think it's a buyer's market for employees now, isn't it?
There are always 2 solutions to a shortage of labour. One of them is to pay more, and the other is to automate more. And in in the catering industry, the latter is always going to be a little more difficult than it might be in, say, motor manufacturing or something. But those are the two places you've got to look. And you've got to think about your operating model. And it's easy for me. I sound terrible because here am I preaching to someone who understands how her business operates, and I have no idea how her business operates. I don't mean to sound preachy. But a lot of businesses will have to rethink about their operating model, and they may well have to end up paying more because, as you say, labour is now an expensive and restricted commodity.
But Sarah would probably say, I mean, I will come back to her in a moment, she would probably say, well, yeah, I can pay more, but that means my prices in my diner go up, which means that maybe I don't get as much trade.
And she's presumably paying more for her supplies.
Yeah, but in economic terms, the prices don't necessarily go up because Sarah will be pricing to maximise her own revenue.
But this is part of what's causing inflation now, isn't it?
It's
part. I'm not saying it's the major part of it, but it is certainly a part. Wage inflation is back.
What's causing inflation? Wage inflation is a reaction to inflation. People demand higher wages because they see inflation around them. It's not the other way around. Inflation is caused by, you can think of inflation as prices going up. That's fair dues. But you can equally think of it as the value of money going down. And the people responsible for the value of money are the Bank of England, and they have taken their eye off the ball.
Yeah.
And they have somebody in charge now who says he is helpless.
Let's move on to Danielle on this, because this is right up your street, this question, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that we can talk about here, but I've worked in restaurants myself, and I know that a lot of people working in the industry have decided to take a career break or to leave the industry after COVID. They decided that the unsociable hours were not for them, especially after being, in lockdown and not going to work. They decided that they wanted to change their career paths, and that's completely understandable. But I think there is a lot that the government could be doing to help businesses to try and get more people into work. And this is a problem in rural areas, particularly businesses that are. I think it was in the Times today. They said that the high percentage of young people in rural areas do not believe that they could have a career in their local areas. They have to move to a bigger city. And I think we really need to start talking about how people can have careers in industries that, like catering, like farming, and actually do well out of it, not just, office work or desk work, things like that. And we need to talk about the benefits that those bring. And even if you do want to go into desk work, you can still work in a restaurant, you can still work on a farm, and you can learn a lot about yourself and a lot about, how you work with others. And there's a lot to gain from working in those kind of environments. And I really don't think that we've been pushing that message enough recently. But in terms of what the government can be doing, I mean, I'm very disappointed to see that they've gone ahead with the employers' national insurance contribution hike, the 1.25% health and social care levy, as it's been branded. That's applying to employers as well as employees. So I think that's going to make, the cost of hiring a lot more expensive, which is just more adding to this problem that we're seeing now. It's going to prevent employers from being able to give raises because of the burden of taxes on businesses at the moment. The business rates reforms that they've been looking at are good, but there's always more that it could be done on that. And corporation tax going up to 25% next year. Again, just completely the wrong signal to business right now. We need to be having a low, stable tax environment so that businesses know what to expect, they know what to plan for. And I think, putting taxes up right now is completely the wrong message for growth.
But when you've
jobs.
got such a deficit, you've got to get the money from somewhere. And a lot of people would argue, well, businesses had it too easy for too long in terms of taxation. We've had low taxation on most businesses. And therefore, to put it up to 25%, does sound quite a dramatic leap from 19%, but it's still historically quite low.
But when you cut taxes for businesses, it actually does the reverse, and you actually bring in a bigger tax take because people have more money in their back pockets, businesses can grow, they can hire more people. So it's all contributing to the economy, and it's actually making for a better economic prospect for the entire nation, not just for the businesses themselves.
Okay, Freddie?
It's a sign of just how strange the political times are right now, that it's the Tory peer who is talking about the virtue of wages going up. This was the argument during all that those Brexit decades. One of the big arguments was if you have a finite labour market and there isn't this limitless supply of cheap immigrant people from the continent, wages would go up and we would return to a more normal economy where people were valued more properly for the work they do. And it's it's interesting that came from you, and it does feel like, although of course this doesn't help Sarah, and of course for businesses it is tough, but some kind of restoration of being paid properly for the work you do, which will ultimately correct itself and bring people back into the workplace, seems like it may, dare I say it, not be a bad thing.
Let's go back to our caller, Sarah.
Hi. Well, I should have said in my introduction that in the past year, my wages have gone up 22%. And don't forget, I was a living wage employer before this all started. So, yeah, they've gone up a lot. But as you were saying, if I put the wages up, I've got to put the prices up. And, we as we're going to put ourselves out of business if we continue on that trajectory at some point. There's a limit to what someone will pay for fish and chips roadside, no matter how good it is.
Sarah, I'm going to have to let you go because there's an awful noise on the line, which I think is probably piercing our listeners' ears. But thank you so much. Really, really interesting question. We'll come to more of your questions in just a moment. It's 8:47.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
When I tell you the sums involved, the amount of money that's being lost to the NHS because people do not keep their appointments to see a doctor, let's stop with the pussyfooting around. The fine should come in as 2 o'clock this afternoon. Millions of wasted GP appointments, reports one newspaper. Almost 4.5 million consultation slots recorded as did not attend this year. That has cost the NHS £175 million, £1.4 million a day.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 to 9 on LBC. Daniel Moylan, Joe Phillips, Freddie Sayers and Danielle Boxall here answering your questions. The next one is from our good friend Sean in Concert. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Ian. Hello, panel. Can you tell me if there's any justice in this Chancellor giving £400 not to the needy, to the rich as well as the poor? Do you think this is an absolute joke on his behalf, and should he look at it again?
It's a good question, actually, isn't it? Because I don't know how many billions of pounds this is costing, but it's very untargeted. Everyone's going to get it. I suppose it makes it simpler to administer. But as Sean says, Freddie says, should this money not be going to those who really need it?
Danny will come in and give you the technicalities on exactly how much we'd save by distributing it only to certain people. Probably it's just simpler this way and will have more impact. I don't know. But I think what's really amazing about this story is that because we've just come out of this extraordinary 2-year period with the pandemic where £260 billion was spent on the COVID response, you get announcements like this that cost 10 or 20 billion and no one even pays much attention to it. I think we're going to be into a whole new normal now where these kind of hand-in-pocket gestures by chancellors are going to have to become regular because it's what people now expect.
Danielle?
Yeah, I think Freddie's right with that analysis, but I do think it's kind of sad that we've got to that state. I don't want to see billions of pounds just being thrown around here, there and everywhere. I don't think taxpayers want to be seeing billions of pounds being thrown around. I mean, it's good that the Chancellor has helped people, and it's very understandable that he wants to help people with the cost of living. I do think that the help to those that are worst off was a good thing, but this £400 bailout effectively to everybody, I do think is untargeted. It's going to be awfully costly, and I think there is a lot of better measures that the Chancellor could have reached for that he should have done. For example, bringing forward the 1p income tax cut and doubling it, and that would produce growth. That would keep people. That would let people keep more money in their back pockets, which would help them with the cost of living crisis. Because at the end of the day, the biggest bill that a family will pay in their year is the tax bill. So I would have liked to have seen the Chancellor doing a bit more on the other side of the ledger, rather than just handing out money to millionaires, as Sean said.
Daniel.
Well, I think that's a little bit unfair. The £400 is a discount off the electricity bill. It's not just simpler to do it this way, it's impossible to do it any other way, because there is no record through the electricity companies of whether you're supplying electricity to a poor household or a rich household. So if you want to reach the vast majority of people, you're going to have to do something along these lines. And the fact that a handful, probably, of millionaires will get some money is neither here nor there in the big picture. The only other way you could do it is say, we're not going to reach out to ordinary people. In addition and separately, the Chancellor is targeting money at people on benefits and pensioners. Now, those, you have got databases of those, you know who they are, so you can get money to them. So one way of going about it would be to say, we'll just have the pensioners and the people on benefits. We won't do the £400, but then an awful lot of people who are desperately in need of help wouldn't actually get any benefit. So yeah, it's rough and ready, and round the margins, some of the money is wasted because it'll go to a handful of billionaires and whatever. But that's what he was trying to do, and to do it quickly without having the sort of information that he'd need to do it to make it more targeted.
Because the winter fuel payment goes to everyone, doesn't it?
Income tax cuts, which I would welcome, they would also benefit, but they would only benefit people who are actually in work. And there are an awful lot of people who do need help who are not actually, in the big tax brackets, but aren't on benefits. And those are the people you really need to help at the moment. Sorry,
Joe.
Well, it's a blunt instrument, isn't it? And I think it could have been thought out better, and I think it should have been thought about a longer time ago. I mean, we've all seen this energy crisis looming. We've seen sort of financial worries getting worse around the world, and the impact that's having on absolutely everybody. But I think it is a blunt instrument. There are other things he could have done. They could have kept the £20 uplift in universal credit. Are we going to go into the summer holidays and have the same undignified argument where the government is forced to back down over its ludicrous idea to stop kids having free school meals during the summer holidays? There are lots and lots of things. I think the problem is that the people who are at the bottom end of this, who have got absolutely no wriggle room whatsoever, every penny counts. Whereas for the people who are going to take the £400 who don't need it, like the pensioners who get the winter fuel allowance, yes, you can say, oh, we'll give it to a food bank or give it to charity or something. That isn't really the point. What the government needs to do is to show that it understands what is happening to people.
But didn't Rishi Sunak do that last week with the amount of support that he did provide to people at the lower end of the income scale?
Than nothing, but he could have done it before. He could have done the things that Danielle's talked about. He doesn't have to bring in the national insurance thing. He could have cut VAT on fuel. There are lots of other things that he could have done, and he could have been doing several months ago, rather than do this. It's another announcement. It's a big splash. It's the dead cat again.
Right. Final question from Dominic in Highgate on a text. He says, what do the panel think of the Home Office keeping the Windrush report under wraps? And now it's out there. What can we learn from it? Joe?
Well, what we can learn from it is...
I need you to all be quick on this.
That it's an absolute disgrace. It should have been published. It does tell us pretty much what we expected, that there's been sort of institutional racism, and it needs to come out now, and there needs to be a full, proper national conversation.
Freddie says, do you think the Home Office has basically been operating an institutionally racist policy, immigration policy, for the last 30 years, i.e. if you've got brown or black skin, you're less likely to be allowed in?
I think it's hard to say that with certainty, and I'm a bit cautious before bandying around those phrases. It feels like we're very keen to call things institutionally racist these days. We need to look in detail at the report, and clearly, the Windrush scandal was a terrible mistake. I wouldn't go as far as that, and I think we should be a little bit more careful before using those kind of phrases.
Okay, Daniel?
I don't think it's institutionally racist, but I do think there's one thing I complain about bitterly, which we haven't discussed enough, which is that since 2002, progressively, government has made British citizenship less and less meaningful, in that they have made it easier and easier for the government to take it away from you by administrative fiat. So the whole question of what is it to be British, the Home Office has forgotten. The great thing about most of the Windrush generation, I mean the vast majority of them, was that they were British already. They had every entitlement to be here. And it was the failure to recognise the importance and, if you like, the sanctity of that nationality and that entitlement which underlay the whole thing, because you couldn't produce the right documents, because you never had the right documents, because you came as a kid with people who didn't need any documents. And it's that devaluation of what it means to be British and what British nationality is that I think really is the charge that has to be levelled at the Home Office.
Danielle?
Yeah, I haven't read the report, so I couldn't say, one way or another. But I do think there is a lesson to be learned in how long it's taken for the report to be released, and why it has taken so long. I mean, it was before COVID. It feels like it was so long ago when this was a scandal. So, I do think we need to make sure that these things don't happen again. And there is a lot to be learned from that scandal that we can apply to modern day immigration policies.
Right, our fun text for the end of the programme is from Janie in Southend. We're hearing grammar schools, pounds and ounces, and power shortages could be returning in one big 1970s throwback. What 1970s music act would you bring back if you could? Now, two of our panel won't remember the 1970s, so I'm going to let them dredge their memories for a moment. Daniel?
I don't remember the 1970s for other reasons. I lived through them in a bit of a haze.
Oh, really? Tell us more.
I'm not entirely sure what the music act would be, but I do have a vague recollection it was the time of punk, so I think we definitely need something about something from the Sex Pistols, I reckon.
Well, that's an answer I didn't think we were going to get. Joe Phillips.
I'm stunned, but in a lovely way. I think Cream.
Who?
Cream. Eric Clapton.
Oh, right, okay.
Have you heard of him?
I have heard of Eric Clapton.
Yes. Jimi
Yes.
Hendrix.
In fact, he was a discussion over a dinner table on Saturday night, but I better not reveal what was said. Danielle?
Well, we've already had one music act coming back from the 70s. It's the ABBA.
And I was going to use that one myself, because I'm going to see them on my birthday. Are you?
With David Canzini.
As the half Swedish member of the panel, I've got to join you there.
Of course, I'd forgotten that.
It, and it's happened. It may be virtual, but it's going to bring us a lot of joy.
But I was talking to Richard Arnold on Good Morning Britain on Friday, and he went to the opening night, and he said it takes about 3 minutes before you really believe that it is them. So it's that convincing.
It's going to happen for all sorts.
I'm looking forward to it. Listen, thank you all very much indeed. Daniel Moylan, Joe Phillips, Daniel Boxall, and Freddie Sayers. We have another edition of Cross Question for you tomorrow night. If you missed any of tonight's, you can catch up on the podcast, or you can watch it back on Global Player or the LBC YouTube channel. Coming up in a moment, we were talking about Tory vision sometime during the last hour. We're going to talk a bit more about that over the next hour, because what do you read into the fact that Boris Johnson wants to bring back pounds and ounces? Apparently they want to bring back grammar schools too. Do you think it might be the groat that's the next electorally appealing policy from the Conservatives? What do you want to see from the Conservatives over the next 2 years in order that they could actually get your vote at the next election? Because at the moment, there isn't much of a narrative there, is there? It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, 4 more Conservative MPs have today called for Boris Johnson to face a confidence vote. Among them, Andrew Bridgen and former Attorney General Jeremy Wright. He says lockdown parties in Downing Street have caused real and lasting damage to the government's authority. Alice Lilly from the Institute for Government says the number of letters required to trigger a vote is creeping up.
I think one of the things that's also quite significant is the fact that Parliament isn't sitting this week. So that means actually MPs have been going back to their constituencies, and it may well be that they're getting a bit of an earful from their constituents, and that is actually shifting some views.
European football's governing body has commissioned an independent investigation into disruption before Saturday's Champions League final in Paris. French police who tear-gassed Liverpool fans said thousands turned up without tickets or fake ones. Former Conservative leader Lord Howard was at the game and told LBC UEFA has questions to answer.
It was quite disgraceful. The first notice that went up on the screen when we eventually got into the stadium was that the kick-off had been delayed because of the late arrival of fans. That was a complete lie. Fans did not arrive late. That was UEFA blaming the fans before they knew what was happening.
A French journalist has been killed covering the conflict in Ukraine. Frédéric Leclerc-Imhoff, who was 32, was reporting on evacuation operations near Severodonetsk, where there's been fierce fighting with Russian forces. The Assembly in Northern Ireland has failed to elect a new Speaker for a second time. The DUP has refused to back the attempt, meaning that no First Minister can be sworn in at Stormont. The party wants a key part of the post-Brexit trade deal scrapped before restarting power sharing. Health officials have now identified 179 cases of monkeypox in the UK. People who have had contact with someone with the disease are being told to be risk assessed and may have to isolate.